Welcome to Peninsula Seniors Lecture Series. Sit back, get comfortable, and let's go see what Marty has for us today.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to another Wednesday program. The Peninsula Seniors offers Wednesday lecture program. We've really got, I think, an excellent and exciting program for you this morning. And a good friend of mine, the speaker, who joins me on the board of directors of the SS Lane Victory here in San Pedro, is going to be our presenter. During the Korean War in December of 1950, the United Nations troops were safely evacuated after the Communist Chinese had entered the war. This turned out to be the largest Marine evacuation in recorded history. And the story of that evacuation and the humanity that went along with it is going to be what we hear about this morning. Our speaker this morning is a graduate of Maine Maritime Academy, sailed for the Merchant Marine was a ship operations manager, and is also a licensed captain, a marine manager, and a superintendent of loading. And he's an outstanding young man. And so without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Mr. Greg Williams.
Well, good morning, everybody. You know, it's truly an honor to be here, and I mean that with all sincerity, and it's certainly a privilege to be able to speak with you today. The very first thing I want to do on a personal level is I want to thank all the veterans here. If you're a veteran, could you raise your hand? You know, without your sacrifices throughout history of the United States, we probably would not be able to be here and talk about history and enjoy the friendship that we have amongst each other. So I really want to thank you for what you've done for our country. Let's talk a little bit about the Merchant Marine here. Does everybody know what the Merchant Marine is as opposed to the Navy? Does everybody know what okay. I like to describe the Merchant Marine. It's a civilian job. I like to describe the Merchant Marine as it's like driving a tractor trailer truck. You're moving cargo from point A to point B for a profit. Except for instead of driving a tractor trailer truck, you're driving a big ship, like an oil tanker or some of the big container ships or the cruise ships. Okay, so it's very different from the Navy, even though we're on ships, and it's quite a bit different from the Navy. They have a different role completely. Let's talk a little bit, let's go back in time a little bit. Let's talk about the Merchant Marine in World War II. Okay, the little tugboat John R. Williams on June 24, 1942, is standing by off the coast of Cape May, New Jersey, off the Delaware Bay. Most of you who have been to the East Coast know where Cape May, New Jersey is. Standing by, waiting for an inbound freighter to assist the ship to the dock to unload her cargo. On this particular day, there's 18 men on this little tugboat. When all of a sudden the tugboat explodes in a giant fireball. There's 4 guys on the stern of the tugboat taking a break from their daily work. They're thrust into the air and they're thrown overboard. When they pop their heads to the surface, they see the tugboat sink to the bottom. Of the 18 men on board, those 4 guys were the only survivors. The tugboat had hit a mine planted by the German U-boat U-373 right there off of Cape May, New Jersey. May 20th, 1942, the T2 oil tanker, a civilian oil tanker, is sailing from Galveston, Texas to New Orleans with a full load of crude oil, the SS Halo. At about 1 o'clock in the morning, a torpedo strikes right there just in front of the bridge, rips a gaping hole in the side of the ship there. 19 of the 69 men are immediately killed. Seconds later, another torpedo strikes right there just in front of the engine room, rips another gaping hole. Another bunch of men are killed. The ship sinks in 3 minutes. Not enough time to get into lifeboats, not enough time to get into life rafts. The 23 remaining men leap into the sea, and for the next 6 hours, they're struggling to survive in burning flames and wreckage of the ship. The ship sinks to the bottom in 3 minutes. The tug had been torpedoed by a German U-boat, the U-506. When all was said and done, the men were rescued 3 days later. Of the 69 men on board, there were 4 survivors. The ship had been torpedoed right there at the mouth of the Mississippi River on its way up to New Orleans. July 2nd, 1944, the freight ship SS Jean Nicolet is sailing in the China Sea with a full load of war materials, when all of a sudden at 7 o'clock at night, a torpedo from the Japanese submarine JI-8 strikes right there at number 2 cargo hatch, rips a huge gaping hole in the side of the ship. The ship takes an immediate list to starboard. Seconds later, another torpedo strikes right back there, number 4 cargo hatch, rips a huge giant hole. The ship is now taking a dangerous list to starboard. On this particular day, there are 100 men on board, consisting of 69 civilian merchant seamen and 31 Army officers headed to the Pacific Theater of War. Amazingly, and by the grace of God, for some reason, all 100 men make it into life rafts and lifeboats. The ship sinks. However, an hour later, the Japanese submarine surfaces, and at gunpoint, they bring all of the lifeboats and the life rafts alongside the submarine. Systematically, over the next 6 hours, the Japanese order all of the surviving crew members aboard the submarine. They run them through a gauntlet of bayonets and rifle butts on the stern of the submarine. As the men are walking through, they're stabbed and bayoneted. When they get to the end of the line, their bodies are flung into the ocean. After 6 hours of this, when all was said and done, of the 100 men that safely made it to lifeboats, there were 4 survivors of the 100 men on board. What makes these stories very compelling to me, these were not trained military personnel. These were civilian seamen of the United States Merchant Marine. In World War II, what I would like you to understand is that the Navy did not move cargo. The role of the Navy was very different than merchant seamen. The role of the Navy was naval sea engagements, shore bombardments, ship-to-ship battles, and things of that nature. But remember, we had millions of soldiers all over the globe in World War II. Every one of these soldiers needed helmets, they needed boots, they needed uniforms, they needed underwear, they needed socks, they needed rifles, they needed bullets, they needed tanks, they needed jeeps, they needed trucks, they needed gasoline products for all of them, they needed spare parts, they needed tires, they needed petroleum products. All of this cargo, the role of delivering all of this cargo to troops throughout the world fell to the civilian seamen of the United States Merchant Marine on ships just like this one. If you go back in time when we were fighting with sticks and stones, battle strategy has always been the same. If you can cut an enemy supply line, you can win a battle. Does everybody agree with that? Well, guess what? The Nazis and the Japanese understood that very, very well. That's why in American folklore, we all know what a U-boat is, and we all know what a wolf pack is. The Nazis would take their submarines, called U-boats, band them together in a wolf pack, sit them off of the east coast of the United States, all through the North Atlantic, off of Newfoundland, all through the Caribbean, in the Gulf of Mexico. And they simply slaughtered these merchant ships that were leaving port with all the supplies that were needed to supply the troops. One of the things that's real important to understand is that it wasn't until we started mass producing these ships, assembly line style, that we started to get the upper hand in World War II. As gruesome as some of these stories are, what I want to tell you is how great America was and how we came about to overcome some of these problems. In 1941, over 3 times as many ships were sunk as were launched. And in 1942, the enemy sank an average of 33 ships a week. It was a staggering loss of men, ships, and materials. One of every 26 civilian merchant seamen never came home and still rests at the bottom of the sea today. It was the highest casualty loss ratio of all of the services. The Navy lost 1 of every 144 men. The Army lost 1 of every 64 men. The Marine Corps lost 1 of every 36 men. And the Merchant Marine lost a staggering 1 of every 26 men. In fact, it was such a staggering loss that Franklin Roosevelt, our president, FDR, refused to allow the press and the public to know what was going on with the merchant ships. So the number of losses of merchant ships was never, ever released to the public during wartime. The theory was they didn't want all of the people that were working in the factories that were sewing boots and sewing uniforms and making rifles and making jeeps and making planes. They didn't want those people to know that the product of their efforts was being sunk 2 hours after leaving New York Harbor, or Boston or Miami or Norfolk. So it would have been a horrible morale breaker for the United States if the public knew that all of these ships were being sunk very shortly after leaving. So this chart right here, I want you to take a quick look at it. Look at the front half of the war, the black bars. This shows the number of sinkings. You can see that the number of sinkings far exceeded the number of launchings. But what we want to talk about today is it wasn't until we started mass producing these ships assembly line style. Let's look at this slide real quick. You can see that the submarines were very, very active. Nobody was immune from the sinkings. This was a passenger ship. There were many passenger ships that were sunk with great losses of life. Here you can see that the vast majority of the sinkings were in the North Atlantic because that's where the ships were convoying from, out of New York and Newfoundland and Boston, all the way to Europe. Let's get back to what we want to impress on you today is that once we started mass producing ships, assembly line style, that we started to get the upper hand of World War II. This is a great photo that you're looking at of Cal ship over on Terminal Island. This is the shipyard over on Terminal Island that produced a staggering number of ships. Here you can see ships in all different phases of construction. In fact, our shipbuilding program became so efficient and so important that there was great competition amongst the shipyards to produce ships in a timely manner. Every industry that and everybody here has been in some type of industry, and you all have a trade magazine for your industry. This is a magazine called Cal Ship Log from the Cal Ship shipyard over on Terminal Island. Look at the date, July 1st, 1942. This particular magazine is heralding the fact that they have built and launched 15 ships in 1 month. Here's the interior story. Cal Ship does the impossible. 15 ships delivered to Uncle Sam in a single month. It took all kinds of great people to come and to leave their positions in life and come and work in the shipyards. Here you can see a wholesale tire salesman. You can see a florist. You can see a maitre d' at a hotel, and a Posh hotel down in Los Angeles. And a lot of different people came together. Here's another great magazine cover from Cal Ship. This magazine is announcing the 200th ship built and delivered to the government in World War II. Now look at the date on this magazine. June 15, 1943. That is a mere 18 months after Pearl Harbor, and one shipyard has already delivered 200 cargo ships. Another great picture, aerial view. You can see all of the ships in various states of construction. Now, what types of ships did we build? And I'm going to defer to the slides here for a minute. We built a number of different tankers. Tankers were very important because we had to deliver gasoline all over the world. We had to deliver petroleum products, so tankers were very important. That SS Halo that you saw that was blown up off of New Orleans was a T2 tanker. We built a number of Victory ships, of which the Lane Victory is. 534 of those. Those came on late in the war, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. But the vast majority of the ships that we built were Liberty ships. We built 2,700 Liberty ships in World War II for just shy of 4,000 ships overall were built. One of my favorite pictures right here, Rosie the Riveter, and thank you to all the women who served in World War II, filling in the factories. Long Beach has a Rosie the Riveter museum that's devoted to all the women that built the airplanes over at Douglas Aircraft. On the Lane Victor, we have a nice little part of our museum devoted to Rosie the Riveter. The vast majority of them were welders and riveters and ship fitters, and so here's a great picture of a group of women shipbuilders at Cal Ship. Another great slide here, 467 ships built by Cal Ship over on Terminal Island in a period of 4 years. That is a staggering number of ships for one shipyard to build in a 4-year period. This is a picture of a Liberty ship still in operation. There's only 2 Liberty ships of the 2,700 that are fully operational. One is up in San Francisco. This one happens to be out on Chesapeake Bay. Let's go back to this slide for a minute again, because I want you to look at the closing years of the war, where you can see where we started to launch a lot more ships, and the sinkings were way down, and of course we started delivering more supplies and were able to effectively close out World War II. There's a Liberty ship in fully loaded at sea. Let's talk about the Liberty ships. This next sequence of slides, I want to defer to the slides a little bit as well, because this describes what a Liberty ship was like. It 441 feet in length, 56 feet across, had a speed of about 11 knots. There were over 2,700 of these built. The reason we built so many of these ships, the design was already in place. We didn't have to go out and reinvent a new ship or redesign a new ship. Time was very, very short. This was a British design. These ships were welded, and if you could weld a ship, now you could prefabricate a ship in various parts of the shipyard and then bring them all together. Those aerial pictures that you saw of all the different ships in states of construction, well, the parts of those ships were all being manufactured in different parts of the yard, and they would all be brought down to the docks to put the ship together. Okay, the ships are, as you saw in the other pictures, the Liberty ship is very box-like in construction. A box-like structure means that you could use that ship for a number of different uses, hospital ships or tankers or things like that. Okay. One of the biggest reasons that we built so many Liberty ships is they had the triple expansion engines, those big piston steam engines. Everybody remember the movie Sand Pebbles with Steve McQueen? Remember that movie? Remember he's always filmed in front of that expansion engine with the pistons going up and down. That's the type of engine that was on the Liberty ships, only it was about 4 times the size of the engine in that particular movie. Incidentally, we have the engine from the Sand Pebbles movie on board the Lane Victory. It was found in a Hollywood producer's backyard shortly after the movie, was donated to our ship. We completely restored it, and it's fully operational again. So when you come down to the ship, we'll take you down to see that particular. Liberty ships were named after people. You can see in this slide, patriots, scientists, journalists, educators, industrialists, and that. There was only one criteria for naming a Liberty ship, that the person had to be dead. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this slide. These are some of the people that you might recognize that have Liberty ships named after them. Elihu Yale is a fellow who gave a sizable donation to a little tiny college back in New Haven, Connecticut, which later became known as some college, Yale University or something like that. So Jack London, Herman Melville, Louis Pasteur, Israel Putnam, one of my favorite little-known people. He was a general in the Revolutionary War, one of George Washington's favorite generals, promoted to general at age 23, very, very young and heroic and courageous young man from my hometown back in Connecticut. George Westinghouse, Mark Twain, Alexander Graham Bell, Samuel Colt, the maker of the great firearms there. Richard Henry Dana wrote 2 years before the mast. For those of you who don't know, that Dana Point right here in Southern California is named after Richard Henry Dana. Abner Doubleday invented baseball. F. Scott Fitzgerald, Zane Grey has roots here in Catalina. Juliet Lowe, ladies, anybody know Juliet Lowe? That's right, the founder of Girl Scouts in America. George Meade, the famous Civil War general. Mary Pickford, Sam Adams, the great Boston patriot. Not the beer, the patriot back in the 1700s. Phineas Banning, I know Marty's a big fan of Phineas Banning here in our local history. Amelia Earhart was the first woman to have a ship named after her. Wyatt Earp, Lou Gehrig, the great baseball player. Francis Scott Key. Jean Nicolet, if you know, Jean Nicolet was a French scientist, did a lot of exploratory work up in the Pacific Northwest. Edgar Allan Poe, Paul Revere, P.T. Barnum, and on and on and on. So some great people had Liberty ships named after them. As you can imagine, trying to name 2,700 ships after people, there's going to be a lot of crossover here. So you can see I threw this in just for the fun. You can see 14 ships with the last name Smith, 9 with the last name Jones, 7 with the last name Brown, 6 with the last name Johnson. 222 ships had the first name John, and 193 ships had the first name William. Of the 2,700 Liberty ships that were built, there was only one ship that was named after someone still alive. The SS Francis O'Gara. Francis O'Gara was the purser on board the Liberty ship that we talked about earlier with all the men that were slaughtered. He was thought to have been killed in that slaughter, but was later found after the war in a Japanese POW camp. The ship had been named in error. So let's talk a little bit about the Victory ships. The Victory ships came on late in the war. The Liberty ships were our design, and as you know, the Victory ships, as we saw earlier, were very slow. They could go about 11 knots. A German U-boat could go about 10 knots, so they couldn't really outrun the German U-boats. They had some structural designs. They had a lot of cracks in the heavy seas, and they were limited in their cargo capacity. The Victory ship was a huge improvement. It was a steam turbine. It was much faster at 17 knots. It was a little bit better hull design, so it could move through the water a little bit better, a little bit better cargo gear. The Victory ships and the Liberty ships were used for a lot of things other than cargo. We used them to move troops all over the place. Most of the groups that I speak to, somebody in the audience went to Europe on a Victory ship or a Liberty ship or came home on one. So let's talk about a little bit about the Lane Victory, where we are today. Here's a great picture of the Lane Victory back in 1950. Now, the Lane Victory, one of the reasons that she survives today, and by the way, the Lane Victory is the only surviving fully operational Victory ship left in the world today. We're very honored to have her here in Los Angeles. She was one of the 467 ships that were built over at CalShip, and she's come home to be with us for the rest of her career, and she has a remarkable career going right now. The Lane Victory was named after Lane College in Tennessee. Now, Lane College has a very interesting history as well. Lane College was founded in 1882 by an emancipated slave who couldn't read or write. So he went on to educate himself and learn to read and write. He became a minister, and he founded Lane College because he wanted all emancipated slaves to have a vehicle to learn to read and write. So it's a remarkable story. During the Korean War, as Marty mentioned, the Lane Victory had her probably most shining moment. The Lane Victory actually only saw a half of a voyage in World War II. She was launched in June of 1945, right at the very close of World War II. She made a half a voyage during hostilities. By the time she got over to Asia, the war had ended, and she came back and she was put in mothballs, only to be broken out at the start of the Korean War. Now, the Lane Victory saw tremendous action in the Korean War. She made 22 port calls to North Korea. Now, as you know, the boundaries of North Korea went back and forth for many years between the North and the South during that conflict. She played a critical role in going into North Korean ports behind the troops, bringing out wounded soldiers, bringing out damaged equipment, jeeps and tanks and planes that were all shot up, and moving them south or over to Japan where they were, and then she would bring back equipment and just supply the troops on an ongoing basis. However, her moment in the sun came in December of 1950, as Marty mentioned before. In the late summer and fall of 1950, MacArthur and the United Nations troops were pushing north, and they had through Korea, and they had pushed the North Koreans well up into the north. And as we talked about before, in World War II, civilian merchant ships participated in every single invasion. The reason being is you needed supplies to supply the troops as they stormed the beachhead and moved inland. Well, the same thing in Korea. So we were loading hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies behind the advancing United Nations troops in North Korea. However, in the fall of 1950, the Chinese and the North Koreans combined to have a massive push southward. So they pushed the United Nations and the South Korean forces back, and they had trapped and encircled 125,000 United Nations soldiers and 100,000 North Korean refugees in the port of Hungnam, North Korea. They were completely surrounded, with the only exit was the sea. The decision was made to evacuate all of these people, and it took 200 ships over a 3-week period to evacuate 125,000 United Nations soldiers, 100,000 North Korean refugees, 365,000 tons of supplies, and 17,000 vehicles were all evacuated. This next sequence of pictures, take a look. This is what the evacuation looked like. As far as the Lane Victory goes, the Lane Victory took 7,009 North Korean refugees in one load and moved them south. So there's a picture of what 7,009 North Koreans looks like on the deck of the Lane Victory. The entire ship was full. All the holds were jam-packed. As remarkable as that is, the Lane Victory taking 7,009 refugees, there was another ship called the Meredith Victory. It's known in maritime circles as the Ship of Miracles. The Meredith Victory stood by and waited till every last refugee who wanted to go was aboard. And she ended up sailing Hungnam with 14,000 North Korean refugees on board. The story, the reason she's called the Ship of Miracles, it is a remarkable story. There's a DVD and there's a book out. I encourage you to read it. She was ordered to go and pick up the last of the refugees, yet she had not quite completely finished unloading her cargo. So she went over and started boarding refugees. They filled the ship by the thousands. When all was said and done, 14,000 refugees were on board, and she pulled away from the dock. She worked her way through landmines that were in the harbor and made her way. The cargo that was not completely unloaded consisted of drums of jet fuel down in the cargo hold. Now, keep in mind, we've all seen the television show MASH with remember the sequence of shows in the wintertime, how bitter, bitter cold it was. We're talking about December 1950 in North Korea. Bitter, bitter, bitter cold. A lot of the North Koreans, once safely aboard, started to build little fires to keep warm on board the drums of jet fuel. The reason it's described as the Ship of Miracles, because some miracle occurred that the ship simply did not explode with all those people, and she safely delivered actually 14,000 plus 5 newborns on board during that passage south. So it's a remarkable story. Christmas Eve on 1950, December 24th, after the last refugee and the Meredith Victory and the Lane Victory and the Navy was gone, all the supplies were loaded, United Nations forces blew up the entire port of Hungnam to keep the Chinese and the North Koreans from making use of the port. This is a great slide right here. This shows you the importance, the significance of the merchant marine all through history and military history. 10 million tons of cargo loaded through this one particular port. You see a Liberty ship in the background in this picture. It was estimated that it took 7 tons of supplies to support one soldier for 1 year in World War II. So you can imagine the staggering amount of supplies that had to be moved to support millions of soldiers throughout the world in World War II. Now remember, we did not have containers back then like you see today, the big colorful containers on container ships. We are talking pallet by pallet, bag by bag, box by box. Millions of tons of cargo. That brings us to where we are today. Let's talk about the Lane Victory a little bit today. As I said, we're very thankful to have the Lane Victory here in Los Angeles. And as she's been graciously restored, she was given to the United States Merchant Marine Veterans of World War II by an act of Congress in 1988. She was delivered to the Merchant Marine Veterans of World War II. She was towed down to Los Angeles, where she was lovingly restored to full operational capacity, where she is today, by an all-volunteer crew. Every single person from the captain on down is a volunteer. And they spend their days. I personally go down there every Saturday to chip paint and paint the ship and do whatever Marty tells me to do on the ship. But we do take the ship out We used to take it out 6 times a year, but this year we have 3 cruises, very, very successful cruises. I'm going to defer to some of these slides. Okay, so the Lane Victory, she's on our cruises. We sail at about 8:30 in the morning. We start loading the ship around 7:30. It's a great continental breakfast as the folks board on board. We have a nice cruise down the river that's narrated because the Port of Los Angeles has a tremendous history. If you've ever taken a cruise throughout the port, some great passenger ships have visited us here. The Navy has played a huge role in Los Angeles here. So there's a great history just going down. One of the most touching things of our cruises is the memorial service that we have. Once we get outside the breakwater, we have a memorial service where we commemorate a particular merchant marine ship that was sunk in World War II. Very touching. The cruise director reads the story of how the ship was sunk. We read the names of each of the crew members that was lost. A flower is thrown over the side. The bell is rung in their honor. And it's quite a remarkable ceremony. To date, we've commemorated, I think, 92 ships so far, and their plaques are mounted with the names of all those seamen throughout the ship. As we said before, the Lane Victory was innovative in her day when they were built. They were steam turbines. This is a picture of the engine room with the 2 steam turbines as opposed to the piston ships. Being fully operational and being a steamship, she's also very hot down there. So when you go down there, it's again, we operate exactly as we did in World War II. So it's quite an experience to see that the engine room fully operational, and it gets quite warm down there. Remember, these ships were mass-produced assembly line style, so a lot of the pumps that you see down in the engine room, lubricating pumps, fuel oil pumps, ballast pumps, bilge pumps, all the different pumps are all basically the same design, so the parts are interchangeable. We have a great lunch on board, catered by some of the local caterers. We have a great brass band on board that plays period music. There's dancing, there's folks in period costume throughout the ship. And this goes on all day long. The highlight of the Lane Victory cruises are the aerial attacks. There's a group in Van Nuys, California called the Condor Squadron. Now the Condor Squadron restores vintage airplanes. So when we go out on our cruise, just shortly after lunch, we're attacked by 4 vintage planes and Nazi markings. They come down and they start dive bombing the ship. Now, as you may or may not know, but the Lane Victory hosts a lot of movies and television programs. We've done over 300 movies and commercials on board. If you saw the movie Flags of Our Father by Clint Eastwood, that was done on our ship. We just got done filming X-Men, the new movie that came out, and so we do an awful lot of television shows. That being said, Hollywood has graciously set up the guns on board of our ship so that they can fire back with compressed air. Makes for an interesting show. Incidentally, we did have a few guns on board in World War II. These guns were for defensive purposes only. With the merchant marine losses as they were in World War II, the Defense Department decided that we needed to mount some defensive weapons on board. So they did have some 5mm cannons and 20mm machine guns on board. There was a contingent of the Navy called the Armed Guard that manned the guns. So anyway, we have those guns on board, and Hollywood has set those guns up so we actually can fire back at the planes. So we get buzzed and assaulted and attacked for a period of time when all of a sudden out of the sun comes the American planes to engage the German planes in dogfight above the ship. It's quite a remarkable show. So Marty and I have been doing this for 9 years now, and we have safely brought the ship home every single time. So thank you to Marty for that. As you can see, the good guys always win, and here's a aerial dogfight right over the ship. So. Here's a nice picture of the Armed Guard and what their station was, and we would be remiss in not acknowledging the Armed Guard, United States Navy Armed Guard, for their role in World War II in protecting merchant ships. So they were a big part of why we started delivering more cargo. Once they started putting weapons on board, we were able to save a lot more ships. When the air show is over, do a final flyover, which is a great photo opportunity and by far and away the highlight of the show. The ship, of course, is a museum in itself. We have a number of museums. This particular museum is in number 2 cargo hold. If you go down there, you'll see torpedoes, and you'll see depth charges, and you'll see jeeps, and you'll see all kinds of great stuff down here. There's a whole display on navigational equipment you can see in the back. Remember, there was no such thing as GPS back in those days, so we did all our navigation they did all their navigation by sextant with the stars and the sun and by lighthouses along the coast. Here's a typical lifeboat which would have been launched. This is a lifeboat from the Lane Victory. Here's the old steam reciprocating engine from the Sand Pebbles. This is typical of what would have been in a Liberty ship, only this is a much smaller version. The Liberty ship engines would have been about 4 times this size, but this is the actual reciprocating engine from the movie Sand Pebbles. Our main museum is a great place to go see. We have all kinds of ship models and memorabilia, newspaper articles, and donations of all kinds. We have guns and rifles and all kinds of neat stuff on board. It's also our meeting hall. We have our meetings there. We've had weddings there. We've had funerals there. We've had parties there of all sorts. So the Lane Victory is available for events. Most recently, on July 28th, the United States Merchant Marine was honored with a commemorative stamp from the post office. They actually issued 4 new commemorative stamps honoring the United States Merchant Marine throughout history. We're very honored to have the unveiling ceremony on board the Lane Victory. They issued 4 stamps honoring a container ship, a clipper ship, auxiliary steamship, and a current day container ship. So it was quite an honor for us to have the Postal Service. Lastly, right here, as I said a moment ago, every single person on board the Lane Victory is a volunteer from the captain on down. Every penny that we raise goes to maintain the ship. Now, since we are a fully operational vessel, we're subject to Coast Guard and American Bureau of Shipping regulations. So therefore, every 5 years, we're required to go into shipyard to have certain inspections done, like boiler inspections and hull inspections and soundings of the thickness of steel and that kind of stuff. So that cost every 5 years is about $900,000. Here's a great picture of our last trip to shipyard in San Diego. This was, I think, February of '09. We took the ship down there, cleaned the bottom, did our inspections, got our certifications. And this is a great picture of what the Lane Victory looks like from underneath. And with that, I'd be happy to take some questions. Great question, and I'm glad you brought that up. Did Henry Kaiser initiate the mass production of ships? The answer to that is yes. As a matter of fact, Kaiser Health, as we know it today, was a result of Kaiser's building ships. Kaiser opened numerous shipyards during World War II and employed thousands and thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in his shipyards. Remember, the record for building a Liberty ship, I'm talking about laying the keel to launching the ship, is 24 hours. 24 hours. In World War II. The competition amongst shipyards and amongst the different crews within the shipyard was there were ships built, it was not uncommon to have a ship built and launched in 36 hours. But Henry Kaiser, to answer your question, needed a health plan for all of his workers. And so the Kaiser Health as we know it today was an outcropping of Kaiser Shipbuilding. That's a good question, and I want to thank you for your service to our country, sir. I appreciate that. So the question is, this gentleman was in the Navy from 45 to 52, and being an enlisted sailor, he was obligated to the ship and to the Navy. The Merchant Marine, being a civilian operation, operates a little bit differently. Men would sign on for a voyage, and they would sign something called articles, which was a contract on what their responsibilities and what their rights were on a particular voyage. So for the most part, civilian merchant seamen were obligated to make a particular voyage, and then they could sign off at voyage's end. The question is, you earned what, $50 a day? What is a month? See, I was giving, all right, okay. $50 a month in the Navy at that time. When I went to sea, I actually earned $55 a day, and that was in 1976 to 86 or whatever that was. So, but I was on a very small ship. My ship went up the Amazon River and all through the Caribbean. But pay scales in the Merchant Marine are a function of power tonnage. So the larger tonnage ship and the bigger the engine, the more pay. So pay scales vary widely. Obviously, somebody on a small tugboat is not going to, as a captain of a tugboat, is not going to get the same pay as somebody on a supertanker. So even though they both have the exact same license as captain. Yeah. The question is, were the Merchant Marine crews in World War II, were they volunteers or conscripted? The answer to that question is they volunteered to join the Merchant Marine. A lot of the merchant mariners were guys that did not get into the Navy or could not get into the Navy or for some reason. I forget the term 4F or whatever it is, but there were a lot of guys that simply didn't qualify for military. So in that sense, a lot of people volunteered for the Merchant Marine. And a lot of them already existed, because remember, the Merchant Marine goes back to quite a ways.
My name is Joe Cohen, and in 1945, two of my closest friends joined the Merchant Marine, and they dragged me with them. And we had our training in Santa Catalina Island, and we were there for, I think, about 12 weeks. And we learned how to, if we were sunk, to stay afloat. We learned how to shoot a 20-millimeter cannon. Where the ballroom is, that was where the cannons were located. And when I say I learned more today than I did in the 3 years that I was in it, and I was on about 7 ships, and I was on Liberty ships, and I was on the Victory ship, and I was on a tanker. So it was 7 altogether. And on 2 of them, we had the Navy with the gunners on it. It's a whole different story when you're out than when you're in, because we were going up the Wasser River in Germany once, and there were mines floating around, and you had to be very careful. We had to look out on the bow and up in the top of the mast, and on a ship that was before us hit a mine, and they didn't make it. But it was interesting. But I learned, believe me, when I tell you, I learned more today than I did in 3 years that I was in it. I'm not exaggerating. I'm telling you facts. So it was very, very interesting.
Thank you for your service to our country, sir. That's a great question. Did the Merchant Marine get any veterans benefits after the war? The answer to that is no. And it's an ongoing struggle right now, and there's acts in Congress trying to get veteran status for Merchant Marine. There was a few things that they did get, but status as a veteran, the answer to that is no. And we are still fighting in Congress to get that status.
My name is Richard Kellogg, Dick Kellogg. I went in that training in Catalina in July 1943 and went through the training program and shipped out for enough months to get qualified to go to upgrading school in Alameda, California, and I got my engineer's license. To get back to the original question, we did not get veteran status until 1986. And at that time, we were issued a discharge, honorable discharge from the Coast Guard. And we got veteran status from then on. Obviously, I came back, went to college, paid for it myself, whereas all the GIs were getting the GI Bill. I didn't get that and never will. But we did get our discharge papers. And
Very good.
you talked earlier about remuneration for the service. As I remember, and I've got on the first Liberty ship, fall of '43 in Portland, Oregon. The name of it was William D. Horde. And you named you listed all the first and last names, but this one was William, first name. And as I remember, it was $120 a month. But as you were out there and you got to certain war zones, well, then you got additional $5 a day when you were in a war zone. So there was some additional things. But when you're on this ship, you don't know what else is going on in the world. You're just all by yourselves and no information. So I can see this fellow's point that you're there, you learn a lot here because I've never seen these statistics put on a chart before. And it's very, very interesting to me to see this. Thank you.
Thank you for your service to our country, sir. Appreciate it. That's a good question, John. Thank you. The question is, what do we think the life of the ship is when compared to some of the DC-3s and 10s that are still vintage aircraft? We had a board meeting a year or so ago with some very fine engineers on board, one in particular, Bob Alexander. And the feeling is that we could run this ship for another 60 years. The problem that we have is volunteers to do the work. I go down every Saturday, and Marty's down there every Saturday. Marty's down there, I think, Monday, Wednesdays, and Saturdays. I'm down there every Saturday because I still work for a living. But we chip and paint, and we do everything we can. The engine room requires a lot of talent. So if you know anybody, if you want to come down on a Monday, Wednesday, or Saturday and just meet the crew, and a lot of the crew are veterans from World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. Some tremendous stories, and it's a pleasant way to keep the memory alive. But to answer your question more specifically, the only thing that's hindering us is volunteer labor. So. That's a good question. Did we gift any of these surplus ships after the war to other countries? I don't know specifically the answer, but I'm going to guess yes because of exactly what you said. There were a lot of losses. We did gift a lot of ships to American steamship companies. Matson Steamship Company here in Long Beach lost a tremendous amount of ships, as did Lykes Lines and all the ships down, the Delta Steamship Company, and all the companies down in the Gulf. So a lot of the surplus ships were given as a remuneration to the shipping companies. And I would imagine that not only did that happen in America, it happened overseas as well. So. Yes, sir.
Where do you find some of the skills necessary? Because as your veterans age and they're not able to maintain the engine, it seems like that's not a skill you just go out and find some young person that has steaming.
As far as skills goes, if you've ever painted a picture in kindergarten, you have the skills to paint a ship. There's plenty of, the question is, where do we find the skills? It takes all kinds of people to run an organization like the Lane Victory. Very few of the volunteers, well, I don't want to say very few, but a lot of the volunteers are just non-maritime people that have a love of history, they have a love of the Navy, they have a love of the Merchant Marine, they have a love of engines, they have a love of planes, of cargo gear, or whatever, and they come down and they do their part. We do a lot of chipping and painting. The engineers are very good. Korean War and Vietnam era engineers come down and they work on the ship, and it's an ongoing thing. So there's plenty of work to be done for all kinds of skills. The question is, can we explain about Chris Brooks on the ship? Chris is a good guy. Chris is the only guy that actually lives on board for security reasons. He raises and lowers the gangway, and he's our ship keeper. He's instrumental to the success of this ship. Chris is the guy that coordinates or helps all the movie guys get around the ship what they need, and we do a lot of movies. He's the guy that loads and unloads all the supplies we need for the cruises and the daily supplies that we need. So he's basically our ship keeper and operations guy. He figures out how to keep the ship running. So. Can we talk about the cadets? The Sea Cadets are also very instrumental into the success of the ship. We invite Naval Sea Cadets of all age groups. Marty, I've seen them as young as what, 8 to 18 or 12, I guess 12 years old. But they come aboard and they do training on board, and it's a great experience for them. You know, they're critical in making the cruises flow well. They do a lot of maintenance, but we also teach them a lot of seamanship. We teach them all aspects of shipboard operations, and the Sea Cadets are very instrumental. And they come from different organizations all over Southern California, and they get to spend the week on board the ship. The question is, do we ever liaison with the tall ships and the naval training ships from other parts of the world? A lot of them are sailing ships. Actually, I was very fortunate in 1976, the bicentennial of this great nation, is all the tall ships from all over the world, some of the largest ones, had a race from Bermuda to Newport, Rhode Island. I happened to be in the college, and my Merchant Marine training ship was the press ship for that event. So we got to go out to sea, and we got to photograph all of those trips. As of right now, we did host some of the Korean Navy training ships. Were in port a couple months back, and so we exchanged things. We don't do a lot with the sail training ships. We have been involved in what they call Navy Fleet Week over the years, where we take the Lane Victory down to San Diego. Navy Fleet Week is where the Navy brings a bunch of ships in and opens them up to the public. We just most recently finished a Navy Fleet Week here in San Pedro a couple weeks ago. So that's pretty much our extent with the training ships. Yeah, the comment is that during that period in World War II, the Goodyear blimp was based out here, was rigged to drop bombs on potential submarines, and apparently that did happen. Yes, sir. The question is, it's recognized that no ship ever accompanied by a Navy blimp was ever sunk. I do not know the answer to that. However, there is a very compelling story of a German U-boat moving up the river in New York Harbor, and that submarine was about to attack a ship in New York Harbor when it was the shadow of the submarine from a blimp overhead was spotted. The Navy came out and destroyed the submarine in New York Harbor.
And I earned $50 a month. What did the Merchant Marine sailors earn?
Well, I don't know the answer to that in those days. I know that when I was a merchant seaman, I enjoyed going to sea. I enjoyed what we were doing. So I'm not sure what the pay scale was. What I can tell you is pay scales vary widely in the Merchant Marine. Any other questions?
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you for watching the Peninsula Seniors Lecture Series. I'm Betty Wheaton. See you next time.